Okay, sure.
Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing tonight?
Yeah!
Thank you all so much for coming out and joining us. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. Um, Wait, is the music still on? Thanks. Okay, we're gonna get right into this. We are so excited to have Alexis, Okeowo, and Naomi Fry with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Alexis's newest book, Blessings and Disasters, which, through a wide range of stories and histories, including her own, presents a fully formed, nuanced portrait of Alabama in a time of conversations and debates full of very divisive, extremist essentialism. This is an incredibly necessary read for everyone in this country, and there is so much to discuss within its pages. Before we get started, though, I'm going to point out a few logistics for how tonight's event is going to go, read some quick bios, and then we're going to dive right in. So first up, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Alexis will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And finally, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Blessings and Disasters online using the link in the live stream description. So our guest tonight, Alexis Okeowo is a staff writer at The New Yorker who has reported on conflict, human rights, and culture across Africa, as well as from Mexico and the American South. Alexis is the author of A Moonless, Starless Sky, Ordinary Women and Men Fighting Extremism in Africa, which received the 2018 PEN Open Book Award. In 2020, Alexis was named Journalist of the Year by the Newswomen's Club of New York. As I mentioned earlier, Naomi Fry joins Alexis in conversation tonight. Naomi is a staff writer at The New Yorker and a co-host of the New Yorker Culture podcast, Critics at Large. That's all for me. Please join me in giving Naomi and Alexis a very warm welcome.
Hi, Alexis.
Hi.
We have two mics, I believe. Like, we have one that we were given, which I guess is for the live stream. Hello, whoever's at home. And then I was surprised to have this one
Me too,
but okay.
I like it.
Yeah. Okay, I guess we'll start. I want to start by asking you, what was the kernel of this book for you? How did it begin? Because as Emily noted, your first book wasn't about America. It was about Africa, and you have reported kind of internationally. And what made you want to start, drilling into this topic of Alabama, where you're from, obviously?
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea came a little bit belatedly after the 2016 presidential election when Trump was elected. And just thinking about the way the South was being talked about, that was true in a lot of aspects, but then it also felt was reductive in other aspects. And feeling like, and then that sort of stirred something deep of when I left the South as a teenager and being in college in the Northeast and being faced with people's stereotypes of how I must have grown up, and feeling like I wanted to push back against that and sort of tell the real story.
Mm-hmm.
And then sort of thinking about, I can approach Alabama like a foreign country in a way. Like it's home, but it's also a place I don't really, that there are a lot of things about it that I'm discovering that I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
and that I want to find out.
What would you say were the main stereotypes that you encountered from people, both, as a younger person leaving home for the first time, and also just, I guess, like post 2016 election? And what did you kind of agree with, and what got you most riled up?
Yeah.
I guess. I mean, those might be the same things, one and the same.
Yeah.
Or not. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like when I started college, people thought the civil rights movement had just ended And I had just come off the streets and the protests, and they were like, "How did you make it? How did you survive?" And I was
Right.
like, this was a couple of decades ago. Um, it was interesting because I hadn't spent a lot of time outside the South when I got to college, and I didn't realize that people's notions of Alabama and the South were as fixed as they were,
Mm-hmm.
and fixed in a specific point in time. And so while there are things I could agree with, like, yeah, race relations is complicated, but turns out complicated everywhere. Um, there were other aspects that I didn't. Just the automatic negative assumptions about how I must have grown up and all the struggles I must have gone through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
In that sense, it does sound to me like it's almost a foreign country, or people perceived it almost as a foreign country.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, where it's like something completely different and detached from the America they know.
Exactly. So I
Yeah.
would either just like sort of get the conversation over with. I'd be like, yeah, it was tough.
Mhm.
Or
Yeah.
or I would push back against it, but then feeling like I was being a weird booster for a place in a
Right.
way that wasn't nuanced, and saying, well, actually, I had a good childhood, but of course it's always more complicated than that.
Of course. Yeah. So if the Colonel was wanting to approach this topic as something more complicated, right, than the stereotypes you might hear kind of bandied about in media or just in conversations with Easterners or whatever. How do you start a project like that? Like
Yeah.
what's the first step? Like, was it daunting to you? Because it would be daunting to me, like thinking about it from the outside. I wouldn't necessarily know how to approach kind of the prospect of doing that sort
Yeah.
of thing. And did you know from the start how you wanted to approach it, or did it take kind of a while to massage that
Yeah.
into place?
It did take a while because at first I thought, should I focus on famous figures from Alabama? Like
Mm.
maybe at the time people were talking about Jeff Sessions. And then I thought, that's not really going to help either to focus on like an extremist politician.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of thought maybe I'll approach it the way I kind of approached my first book, which is focusing on ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew the people I wanted to focus on would have to represent a cross section of Alabama and ideally be surprising and like add to the complication.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of had this idea where I was like, okay, I want a Native American Alabamian because we don't hear much about the Native American side of Alabama.
For me, that was a total. I mean, granted, I didn't know much about, the kind of ethnic and racial groups, the makeup of Alabama, but that whole part of the book was to me a revelation. Something
Yeah.
totally
Yeah.
new.
Yeah. And then I wanted a Latino who, the South, Alabama's heavily Latino now. So I wanted someone who's Latino. I wanted someone who's immigrant, like my parents. I wanted people from, and then I wanted, of course, I wanted some white people and I wanted some Black people. And so but finding those people took time. Some of them were immediately obvious, like the female chief of the only prosperous tribe in the
Mhm.
state. It was like she was obvious.
How did you find her, for instance?
I emailed the press office of the tribe, and I was like, I want to talk to your chief, and she gave me, some of her time.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't really know what I needed it for, and she knew what I needed it for. She didn't really understand the project, but she was down to talk to me
Mhm.
about her life, and I wanted to talk to someone who had close ties to the Confederate legacy of the state. And so I literally went to the Confederate Memorial Park, and I was just hanging around there, seeing if there was anyone interesting to talk to. And the director of the museum came up to me and he said, "What are you doing here?" and then he agreed to talk to me, actually.
Yeah.
Was
that? I mean, that struck me as Calvin, right?
Yeah,
That's
Calvin.
That struck me as kind of a really interesting. It must have been obviously you're a reporter, and so you are used to talking to people from across the spectrum.
Mhm.
But I was wondering if it felt different to you, since Alabama is home and you are
Yeah.
imbricated within its history more than
Yeah.
other places you've reported on.
Yeah. It felt more personal and it felt harder.
It's tricky,
It's
right?
tricky, yeah, because
Yeah.
it's not like when I'm done, I'm still returning. I'm still around. They
Yeah.
can still find me, and so there's
They
like,
can still find that sounds ominous. Yeah.
and so it did. It felt trickier. I felt like I had to be more gentle in the
Yeah.
way I was finding people and seeking them out and asking them to spend time with me.
Yeah. When did you realize that Alabama was important to you? Like, you obviously you grew up there. Home, when you grow up somewhere, it's important to you in the sense, at the very least, it's the only place you know, and that is like your most familiar surroundings, and you're connected to it geographically, just
Mhm.
locationally.
Mhm.
Your family is there. But once you leave, did it immediately become clear to you that this was a place that kind of had a weight for you, or were you trying to kind of put a distance? Did you have to wait a little bit, or some years, or however long, to put distance between you and that place,
Yeah.
before you could sort of realize this is actually part of me? It's something I want to explore. It's something I want to give, like, whatever, 6 to 8 years writing a book about and
Yeah.
returning again and again.
Yeah. It did take time, but I also think there's something about a realization forming an opposition almost when it's constantly being challenged. And I think there was a period I felt like um, the validity of this place as my home was being challenged, and that kind of arose something in me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still as critical of it as ever, but it kind of stirred in something in me to sort of tell my side of it. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, there's something to when I feel like your home is constantly being challenged or questioned or pushed back against.
Or kind of denigrated, even,
Denigrated,
or
yeah,
yeah.
denigrated, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in college they used to call me and other people from Alabama Bama, which I never heard this before. And so
Isn't that like in sport? Like, don't they call it
yes,
team
yes,
Bama?
it's a
Yeah.
football thing,
Yeah,
Bama.
football. Yeah.
But Bama's not a noun. It's
Oh, they just called you
well, I
Bama.
mean, like not all the time, but just
Of
sort
course.
of as like yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that kind of thing sort of rouses in a person, I think, like a desire to kind of say your piece about it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm curious about the title of the book, which I really like, Blessings and Disasters.
Mm-hmm.
Where did that come from? And if you were to try and say, I mean, obviously, you say in the book, in Alabama, we talk about how it's a place of blessings and a place of disasters. I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing.
Yeah.
If you were to say what the blessings are and what the disasters are, it's hard to narrow down. But like, what was your intention with that?
Yeah.
What were you trying to convey?
Well, it comes from a phrase where my thing is that like I think Alabama exists often between that tenuous border between blessing and disaster, and so often it's the same thing. What people think of as a blessing can also be a disaster and the other way around.
Okay.
Um,
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so. I mean, a larger idea of the book is that you know the kind of road to progress that Alabama has had, in my opinion, has been sort of this push and pull among like competing visions of the state by different groups who sort of pull the state, dragging its feet, kicking the whole way towards progress. But it's those people who make the place in the South what it is. All of these different types of people I've included in my book. And
is it always progress though? I mean,
well, any progress that it's had rather has been
Right.
because of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, as often it's pulled forward, it's pulled back.
Mhm.
It's that constant, for better or worse, push and pull, that like edge between blessing and disaster.
Yeah. And the disasters, would you say it's due to kind of the resistance to progress, or maybe sometimes progress can also kind of bring on a kind of disaster, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, yeah, I mean, like the country at large, you can feel like progress, backlash.
Yeah.
And that there can be sort of side benefits to the backlash, but it's not seen until much later.
Right. Yeah. Another thing that struck me, so the book has, for those of you, I mean, probably most of you haven't read it yet. The book is kind of separated into different sections, and each section is kind of subtitled in the first name of kind of those protagonists that Alexis has mentioned or mentioned some of. It's like um, Stephanie, who's the chief of the Porch Creek Indian tribe that Alexis interviewed, and then Calvin, the guy from the Confederate Memorial, and Brandon, who's this Mexican immigrant who's kind of was raised by his mother working the field since he was like 5, which was, pretty shocking, but it's kind of like embodies the kind of American dream in some ways, in your telling or in his telling of himself, at least, right?
Exactly.
Or Tina, this woman, this was very fascinating to me, a woman who was sexually assaulted by Roy Moore, and I want to hear more maybe later about how you kind of approached her and forged a relationship with her. But then all of these kind of subheadings where it's like, Mary, Stephanie, and Calvin, and me. And then you kind of tag yourself onto these stories. And the book is dotted with your own tales, personal tales of growing up in Alabama and things that have happened to you, which aren't necessarily as kind of like dramatic as some of the other events that you describe in the book happening to other people.
Sure.
But nonetheless, you kind of pursue them alongside these other protagonists that you choose to write about in the book. And I was wondering if this was something that you, from the beginning, were you like, okay, I'm gonna kind of include myself in this? Was this something that you had ever kind of, like, how comfortable you were with pursuing this kind of slightly memoiristic bent? It's not a memoir, but it has memoiristic elements. And what was that like for you to include that?
Yeah, that was not the plan originally.
Okay.
It was supposed to be pure reported about other people and telling the history that way. But then I think it became clear I was going to be maybe in it a little bit, and then it became clear that it would be better if my story and my history was pulling it all together, and that if it became more clear to the reader who was telling the story and why.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and that also helped me, because then it sort of helped me string these very disparate people and disparate moments in history together.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also interesting, like kind of thinking about memories from the past, things I hadn't thought about in years, and thinking about how they shaped me and why they were specific to Alabama.
Yeah. How did you approach that? Had you had a lot of experience writing about yourself before, or even to yourself, not necessarily published, but
not really. But I've read a lot of writing about other people who've written about themselves.
Sure.
And I took note of what I liked and didn't like.
What did you like and didn't you like? Where did your taste lie in that?
I liked when people were, obviously when people are really honest, and when people share things that are maybe not so flattering, but that give insight into who someone is. So I was trying to include things that maybe I would find, not so flattering or maybe a little bit embarrassing, but just sort of talk about, this is who I was at this time and this is why.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was it harder for you to write those kind of personal mini essays than the other parts of the book?
Yeah, I mean, it was much easier, hanging around with like Calvin, for example, and talking about his Confederate legacy than talking about my time on the speech and debate team,
Yeah.
competing at tournaments.
Yeah.
I was kind of manic about that, but yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, there was, but I do think it helped me then think about what am I trying to say about this place?
Mm-hmm.
Because it all I think comes from like my own experience and
Yeah.
what I saw and what I'm trying to relate to the reader.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think that helped you, like in kind of articulating the, I guess I would call it like the multiplicity maybe of Alabama, because
Yeah.
it's the kind of multi-layered nature of the place. Yeah, surprised me too. I just didn't know much, even though I've been there.
Oh, you have?
Yes. I have a friend who teaches at Auburn.
Where? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Our
This was a few years
brother
ago.
went there.
Yeah. So I have been there.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that I know much about it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And so yeah, so I was surprised by a lot of it. But I guess it just seems to me, when I was reading the book, I was like, how did Alexis, like, there's so much to say, and there's so many strands of it,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
There's so many strands historically,
Yeah.
because the book includes a ton of kind of deeply researched, kind of like historical background and context, right?
Yeah.
Then there are the many different strands of personal stories that you talk about, which kind of stand in for different aspects of, different racial groups, different ethnicities, class issues,
Yeah.
all of that. And then there's the kind of personal aspect of it. Structurally, how did that get pulled together?
Yeah.
Like, how did you even work on it? Like, how did you know how to do that, and when did you decide that would be the way?
Yeah. I feel like structurally it was a hot mess for a while.
Okay.
Because I
Did it change a lot?
Well, I knew from the beginning I didn't want it to be like separate. My first book was like separate stories. I wanted it to feel like one narrative.
Yeah.
And so the idea, always the task was like, how can we make this all feel like it's joined together? So we're starting literally when Alabama was Indian Territory, and we're coming up into the present, and we're inserting different people at different moments. They come in, they disappear. And how do we make this feel like the reader can follow along?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it took time, but I had great editors who helped. And I think, actually, my editor said something really interesting, which was just like, what are the, especially for each chapter, what are the ideas behind each chapter, and
Mhm.
how are they furthering the general argument, which is
Yeah.
about home? Why are people staying in this place that others have written off?
Yeah.
How is each chapter reflecting that, and who needs to be pulled in, and which moments need to be pulled in to reflect that?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was very helpful in
Yeah.
terms of thinking, who needs to come in now? What do I need to share about their story? What moment in history is relevant? And then, keep going.
How did you work on it in terms of like, did you kind of like do historical research all in one chunk and then do the reporting, and then, or was it all kind of like?
No, I think it was different moments. I think I started with like Creek history, because even growing up, I didn't know actually a lot about this Indian tribe in Alabama that's tiny but extremely prosperous, like $1 billion. And so I had a lot to do reading on them first. I interviewed Stephanie, who's the tribal leader. I went down, spent time with her, and then I was reading and then I went into my like Civil War period, Reconstruction, and then I was a lot of books about that while I was spending time with Mary, one of my subjects. So it was, and then I was reading about the Confederacy, and I was reading about memory, and then.
Where did you do most of your research? Like, did you have any kind of specific residencies or something?
Yeah, or? I did. I did something. at the Sage Russell Institute in New York, which was really helpful. And a couple other like short-term residencies. And then and also just using resources in Alabama. A lot of the Creek stuff was from there, and reading a lot about immigration to Alabama, which I hadn't known about until I was spending time with Brandon, who's this young DACA recipient and farm worker. And it was actually a huge learning experience for me along the way. I was learning all these things I didn't know about my home.
Yeah, I mean, the book really has a lot. It's not like it's very dense. It's quite dense. Not to say that it doesn't tell you can't follow a narrative, but it really has a lot of different layers of kind of knowledge and forms of knowledge. I really identified with the parts of the book where you talked about your identity as an immigrant, as a more precisely like a daughter of immigrants from Nigeria, and the deep sense of like being Black African and wanting to be. You say at one point, I think I marked this to myself because it really struck me. Where is it? Oh yeah, it starts the end. Would you say sorry. Yeah. All I wanted was to be Southern and American in that order, right? Rather than African.
Yeah.
And this is something, was that an experience that was kind of painful for you growing up, or just like, did you accept it? Not painful, like traumatic, but just like a kind of like, I'm American and Israeli, and for me, wanting to be American, which I am now technically, but just the coming as a young girl to America and not being American and knowing that everybody else, or seemingly everybody else, was American, is like maybe the most defining experience of my life, and has like determined like literally every interest I have, over the next like 40 years. Was that something that kind of developed over time in you, or was that something that you kind of sensed with clarity always? Or
no, I was not that clear-minded, but I think, and it's an interesting sensation because my brother and I, as we're growing up, on the face of it, it's like, people just assumed, of course, we're Black Alabamians, but then it's like, oh, you have a different last name, and so that makes you other. And I think it wasn't until I was older that I was like, the benefits of that sort of insider-outsider status that I write about is something that I think is so valuable and that has shaped, everything I've done since then.
Yeah.
But at the time, it's hard to see, because I think probably many people can relate. When you're growing up, your world feels so insular and it feels so closed. And so there are a lot of things you're trying to conform to, whether it's, I write about how sort of the white and Black kids I both knew had the same sort of coming in age rituals. The white kids of means, whether it was like cotillion or debutante, and then the Black kids had Jack and Jill.
Right.
And my parents were like, you're not doing any of that. And so it was like,
Was it because it was like, was it on kind of moral grounds, or
it was just like, this is not our tradition. This is not what we do. Like, we have our own things that we do. Like, this is not, you don't need to worry about that world, which I can now see from their perspective. But as a kid, you're sort of like, all of my friends are doing this. Why am I not doing this? Yeah.
But it's, I'm wondering if you see kind of your, like, this position of being kind of an insider outsider as something, do you feel that it's kind of like, trying to think of a way how to articulate this, like the kind of nature of Alabama as you describe it is is basically like nobody is completely an insider. Like each group has its
Yeah.
own
Yeah,
levels of kind of insider
absolutely.
outsiderhood.
That's actually, yeah, that is a great point because the Creek that I spent time with, I mean, they are truly the first Alabamians, but still to this day are not, are still made to feel a bit like outsiders,
Yeah.
even though they consider themselves simultaneously native and Southern at the same time. A lot of their neighbors won't let them forget that they're different. Same with recent Latino immigrants. Same with and so I guess that is the tension in sort of loving a home that doesn't fully
Love you back.
exactly.
I was very touched by the section about Brandon, the Mexican kid, who is so. I mean, his kind of desire to be kind of a model immigrant, kind of model minority, I guess. But yeah, not even model minority. He literally is like in constant, most of his life in constant fear of being deported because he and his family are undocumented for most of his life, and realizing that even if he does everything right, he still can't get a social security number. He still can't get a driver's license. He can't travel. All of these things that even if he's like pulling himself up by his bootstraps.
Exactly.
I mean, literally, this is a kid who's worked since he was 5 in the fields, and it's like, and it is it figured as kind of like a happy-ish ending with him? Do you think? Because when we leave Brandon, he works at a bank. Like he's managed to. He's like a DACA person. He's able to get status, and he's able to get a desk job, and kind of start managing people, and like bought his parents a house and all of that. Like, I was curious about your attitude towards that story.
It's changed a little bit because at the time I was thinking of it as more of an happy ending, but now of course there have been ICE raids in Alabama, and he and his family are more limited in their movements. It's like again that thing, as soon as there's progress, there's a backlash. But I think what's been happening in Alabama is something the rest of the country can relate to now. I mean, I think, in this like portrait, which can feel extreme, it seems to me something I can see in so many places now. And I think, the only thing that remains interesting to me about the place are the people. You mentioned someone like Tina.
Yeah, let's talk about Tina for a little bit. Do you want to explain to the audience who she is and how you met her, which I don't know?
Yes, Tina is this white woman from rural northern Alabama who came out against Roy Moore years ago. She was sexually assaulted by him, and she came out during the Me Too movement. And then her life was turned upside down. And it's funny, I don't know, I'm not even sure why I wanted her specifically. There was something about her.
How did you meet her? Did you just read about her as one of the?
Yeah, I just read about her, and then I just set about trying to reach her, but I can't remember why specifically her, because it wasn't until we started talking that I realized how interesting she is.
Yeah.
Not only does she have she got really poor family history of sexual abuse, and then this was a big deal for her to come out. But she has a really complicated relationship to class and race in Alabama.
She's married. Her husband is black now.
Her husband is now her current husband is black. Her stepkids are black, and she has, according to her, some Indian in her family. But everyone in Alabama says that.
Yeah.
and she was just very open and talked in a way, that I thought reflected how a lot of white Alabamians think about their lives, and hopefully in a way that I think was surprising. It was surprising to me too.
How would you characterize the way she thinks about her life as a kind of like proto white Alabamian?
I think that she thinks that it's interesting. I think that she thinks her forefathers were really important in making the state what it was, but that, they got hobbled a bit because they're they interact with Indians and with Black folks. She once said we're just like the Black folks, and but her views have progressed in a way I think that's interesting because of the trauma she's been through, because of her relationships with Black people, and I think and with class, I think that she's become disillusioned with a lot of the things she was told as a Southern white woman would protect her, which is like keeping your mouth shut and
also
being proper.
relying on men.
And
like her
relying on
mother
men.
is kind of a strong figure in her life.
Exactly.
And her mother was always like, just you have to trade on your looks. You have to like get what you can as a woman because you're not going to have any other types of power
Exactly.
that are separate from kind of relying on men. And obviously that turned out to be not the case.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see her journey. And I contrasted a little bit with this Black woman named Mary, who's a daughter of civil rights activist, who also kind of wrestled with her Southern Black womanhood and kind of rejecting that idea of being tied to a man. And then sort of ended up never really partnered, never had children. And so I kind of link their stories a bit too, because I'm really interested in this idea of like what Southern womanhood is. And I talk about a little bit about how it contrasts with West African womanhood, which is what I saw with my mom and my aunties.
Right. And that's how you finish the book, right? Like you end on this note of talking about African Southern womanhood that you know from kind of your mom's close friends who kind of raised you in a sense, as a kind of like surrogate mothers, bossed you around a little bit, even too much. You seem to suggest. Why did you choose to end on that? I thought that was an interesting choice to kind of tie the book together.
Yeah.
It's about you, but it's not just about you. It's about this vision of kind of like the type of womanhood or the type of woman that you could potentially be, an African Southern woman who's older that you saw around you when you were like, whatever, 10, 15.
Totally. I think because of that, because I wanted to, I technically end the book with writing about Africatown, which was the site where the last enslaved Africans who were brought to Alabama once the Civil War ended, they made a home in Africatown in Mobile, and their descendants still live there. And so, and then, they didn't want to stay there, but they made a home there. It became a place where their descendants, as I said, have stayed for decades. And I'm drawing that link to sort of my aunties, my parents who came to Alabama for school. A lot of them met in college at HBCU and then ended up staying. And sort of just the fact that they and I have much of a claim to this place as anybody else. And that's the point, with all of these people in this book. Everyone has a claim to this place and are clearly exercising it. And that's what's making it interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I'm being signaled that it's time for questions from the audience. I think we have 10 minutes or something. Who wants to, start with you.
I wanted to ask you, also as a daughter of immigrants and how much you have aunties and have aunties too. When they were talking to you about what their expectations were and what you could and couldn't do, like Jack and Jill and all that, was it a focus on making sure that you assimilated into American culture or navigating African culture? I mean, how was that experience for you?
I think it was about meeting expectations that probably were found in both, like a sort of not just academic but sort of social excellence, which I think is also very Southern too, right? It's like, you get good grades and you're just, especially as a girl, supposed to be able to this idea of perfection.
Little lady.
Yeah. And so in that in that way, both cultures really coincide.
Yeah.
Curious what your breakfast routine is like these days. There's one of the most vivid parts of the book is you talking about these absurdly large breakfasts that your dad made you eat.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, one, how traumatized are you by these breakfasts?
My brother is laughing right now. He
What are you
remembers.
eating these days?
That is so funny. Yeah, I write about how I think my parents were afraid we would starve at school, even though there was lunch. So we either had pancakes, waffles with, and there had to be protein, bacon and sausage, probably scrambled eggs at the same time. No, so now I have coffee, and I'm good. I mean, yeah, I'm still triggered by that.
Yeah, it's funny, the sort of like care mixed with kind of oppression of that routine, right? Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
When you said you went to school in the Northeast and people would kind of ask you and you realized their assumptions, that you felt like this tension between, kind of explaining it, but also feeling like you had to be like a booster for a place that you didn't fully co-sign, like
Yeah.
approaching Alabama as if it's like another country, but also you having that tie to it. Like, how did you balance that tension in writing it of like being honest and real, not sugarcoating anything, but not sort of endorsing it?
Yeah, that's a great question. She was asking about, yeah, how do I deal with the reality of what Alabama is, and not sugarcoating it. Yeah, I mean, I think that came most into play when I was spending time with people like Calvin, who, even sometimes with Tina, folks who had very differing and sometimes wrong conceptions of what happened in Alabama history. And so my thing was like, I'm spending time with you. I want to hear you out. My whole point of the book is to hear how everyone tells the story of their families and the state. But then also, I'm going to need to fact check you, and so trying to provide context, hopefully, that made sense, and that could, yeah.
It's interesting because you talk a lot in the book about the kind of Southern politeness, right? Where
Yeah.
you're supposed to, even if you disagree with someone, and you often do because of the kind of multiplicity of viewpoints and different types of groups and identities that you encounter on a daily basis, you have to sort of be like, okay, let's talk about church. Let's talk about like
Yeah.
whatever, like something that, let's not talk about politics, right? And there's a thing towards the end of the book where you are sat on a plane from Atlanta to Montgomery, I think, near a white woman who keeps talking about like kind of like fear mongering about like the election being stolen, right?
Mhm.
And you're like,
Right.
you're like,
Right.
and it was, I kept thinking about how that sort of politeness, or the kind of, you have to kind of, you hear someone out, right?
Yeah.
You don't counter and say, no, this is wrong. Like, it's kind of a lot like reporting in some ways.
Yeah.
Because you're like, you're often like interviewing someone, or just like hearing people talk and kind of following, and you don't jump in and say, hey, that was like a racist thing to say, or hey, that was like that was just plain like wrong. You're just like, yeah, interesting.
Right. Right.
And I think that probably kind of served you in good stead as a reporter, that training of kind of like, yeah, listening to Calvin in his like Confederacy Memorial Museum, and being like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what the history was, or this is what we should remember as a country, as a state, as
Yeah, I agree. And I think though, when I saw the way that politeness, Southern politeness, can be pushed to its limits and just doesn't work anymore, is again through Brandon, who is this young Mexican immigrant who is super polite, the most Southern gentleman I've ever met.
He does everything right.
He does everything right,
yeah.
And people are polite to him, but that still doesn't change the situation, because many of his neighbors still want him gone. And so it's like, then we've reached the end of politeness. It's,
yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
How have your feelings about Alabama changed after?
Yeah, that's a good question. how have my feelings changed about Alabama? I think, I think the main sense is that there's a lot still to learn. Even finishing this book and just feeling surprised by a lot of what I've learned and what I've, not just from the history, but from people I spent time with. I'm still curious. I'm still intrigued. I'm still enraged with it all the time and frustrated and sometimes encouraged, but I'm still really curious about it.
I think there was someone there. I think there is.
I was going to ask how you like deal with keeping in touch with your subjects, or like if you want to keep in touch with them and it's not possible, and if they're a subject that you felt like turned off to eventually after having dealt with them.
Yeah. That is the eternal. You can answer this too. That's the thing now. When you report, it's people are tied to you forever, which is probably for the best. But I, I no, like some of them. Yeah, I really enjoyed like Brandon and Tina and some of the folks I loved talking to. Some of them, it was less. It got less intimate. So
like with Stephanie.
Like with Stephanie, yeah, that was always more of
the chief,
exactly the tribal chief. Like we're not. I would love if she contacted me, but we're not. I doubt she would. So I guess unless it was someone I didn't really enjoy, I'm open to hearing from folks, especially if they have interesting thoughts.
Just a quick question. I think it's interesting because, when you're writing or you start off as a writer or you're doing your diary, you write about yourself first. So you're writing this book much later in your career because most people, when they start off, they'll probably write about their hometown first. So I think it's pretty interesting. And so I wanted to know how being a seasoned writer has affected your ability to be more vulnerable and comfortable being more vulnerable. And then also your ability to kind of, really be delicate, like you said, with the subject of writing about your hometown and knowing that you kind of still have to go back there. And then the third piece too is just kind of trying to understand how comfortable perhaps you were in terms of feeling like you're qualified to write about Alabama, or did you just approach it like you're writing about any other place you've written about before?
Yes.
I should note too that Alexis is still very young. I take it hard that it's not her first book. I know what you're saying, but it's like, and she is a seasoned writer, but she's also, she's not like. Yeah.
So as I near my deathbed, I realized no. I think because it is harder. I found it harder to write about home, probably because I was unearthing all these complicated memories, and so this probably won't be the last time, honestly, because I don't even know if I got into my memories the way. But it was reporting about other places really helped, and having the experience of trying to write about places with empathy and with sensitivity aided this project for sure. Yeah.
What made you want to be a journalist?
Oh, that's funny. I'm like a deep introvert, and I think this was just a good way to fulfill my need of being nosy, and like it forced me to talk to people. When I started like on the campus newspaper, I found it like really it forced me out of my comfort zone and being able to talk to people and be nosy and inquire about their lives and hang out with them.
I think we have time for one more.
I was wondering if there are any people or stories that you maybe omitted from this book or like saved for, you mentioned maybe having a second project or furthering a discussion.
I think there were other. Was there anyone I omitted? There were people I talked to. I think at first, especially when I was looking for Calvin, who I chose, even though he's a Civil War, reenactor, and we're very, very different politically. He was incredibly open to me, and I think I was at first talking to people who were not as open and maybe had more sort of like radical things to say. or incendiary things to say, but I couldn't really have a conversation with. And I'm kind of glad I didn't go with them.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming and presenting to Alexis.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions, and thank you to Alexis and Naomi for sharing this wonderful conversation with us. This book has certainly opened my eyes in many, many ways, and I hope it does the same for all of you. So that said, if you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy by clicking the link in the description. For those of you with us tonight, we have a few more extra copies available for purchase if you haven't gotten one already. You can see my coworkers up at the front to do so. Alexis will be around to sign and personalize your books. That's going to be happening right when my coworkers are not pointing to. Yes. So we're going to get her settled back there. And once we do, please make sure you grab all of your personal belongings with you so we can start to break down and rearrange the store, line up down the center aisle, curve around to the wall, and get your book signed, and then have a great rest of your night. Let's give these two one last round of applause.